The phone rang at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was in the middle of reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant knocked on my office door, her face pale with concern. "Mr. Harrison, Lincoln Elementary is online too. They say it's urgent about Mason." My blood ran cold. In 15 years of parenting, that kind of call never brought good news. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I grabbed the phone with trembling fingers, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Has Mason gotten hurt? Is there an accident? The voice on the other end belonged to Principal Rodriguez, and her tone was measured but tense. "Mr. Harrison, I need you to come to the school immediately. There's been an incident involving Mason and his teacher, Mrs. Blackwood. I'd rather discuss this in person." 20 minutes later, I was pulling into the familiar parking lot of Lincoln Elementary, my hands still gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The red brick building had always seemed welcoming before, with its cheerful yellow doors and colorful student artwork displayed in every window. Today it felt different, imposing, almost threatening. The hallways smelled like disinfectant and chocolate milk, just like they always did. But as I walked past classroom doors adorned with autumn leaves and Halloween decorations, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Mason had been at this school for 3 years now. He was in 5th grade, 10 years old, and despite his struggles with reading, he'd always loved coming here, or at least he used to. Principal Rodriguez met me at the main office, her usually warm smile replaced by a concerned frown. She was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. Someone who dedicated her life to education and genuinely cared about every child who walked through these halls. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Mr. Harrison. Please, let's talk in my office." She led me down a short corridor lined with trophy cases showcasing decades of student achievements. Academic bowls, science fairs, art competitions, all the things that made Lincoln Elementary proud of its students. We passed the nurse's office, where I'd picked up Mason countless times over the years for everything from scraped knees to stomach bugs. Each familiar landmark now felt like a marker leading to something I wasn't prepared to face. "Where's Mason?" I asked as we settled into her office. "He's in the counselor's office with Mrs. Chen. She's been with him for the past hour." Principal Rodriguez folded her hands on her desk, her expression grave. "Mr. Harrison, what I'm about to tell you is difficult, and I want you to know that we take this matter very seriously." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "What happened?" "This afternoon, during Mrs. Blackwood's reading class, Mason was called upon to read aloud from their current novel. As you know, Mason has been working with our reading specialist, Mrs. Patterson, to improve his fluency and comprehension skills." I nodded. Mason had been diagnosed with dyslexia 2 years ago, and while we'd made significant progress with tutoring and specialized instruction, reading aloud in front of his classmates remained his biggest challenge. It was something we'd discussed extensively with his teachers, and they'd always been understanding and supportive. Mason began reading, but he was struggling with several words. The passage contained some advanced vocabulary that would be challenging for any 5th grader, let alone a child with dyslexia. Instead of offering encouragement or assistance, Mrs. Blackwood became increasingly impatient. Principal Rodriguez paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. I could see the weight of what she was about to say reflected in her eyes. According to multiple student witnesses, Mrs. Blackwood eventually stopped Mason mid-sentence and said, "This is ridiculous. You're worthless at reading. How do you expect to amount to anything if you can't even get through a simple paragraph?" Words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs as if someone had punched me in the stomach. She said, "What?" "There's more, I'm afraid." When Mason began to tear up and asked to sit down, Mrs. Blackwood told him to stop being a baby, and that maybe if you tried harder instead of making excuses, you wouldn't embarrass yourself like this. I was on my feet before I realized I'd stood up, my hands clenched into fists. 20 years in corporate law had taught me to control my emotions, to think before reacting, to always maintain professional composure. But this wasn't a boardroom negotiation or a contract dispute. This was my son. She called my 10-year-old son worthless in front of his entire class. Mr. Harrison, please sit down. And I understand your anger, and frankly, I share it. What happened today is completely unacceptable and goes against every principle this school stands for. I forced myself back into the chair, but my leg was bouncing with nervous energy. How long has this been going on? Has she done this before? Rodriguez sighed deeply. That's what we're investigating. Several students have come forward since the incident, and I've already begun interviewing them individually. What I can tell you is that this isn't the first time Mrs. Blackwood has made inappropriate comments to students, though nothing quite this severe has been reported before. My mind was reeling. Mason had been in Mrs. Blackwood's class since September. It was now late October. Had he been enduring this kind of treatment for weeks? Months? The thought made me sick. Why didn't Mason tell me? Didn't anyone report this sooner? Children often don't report these things, especially when they come from a figure of authority. They internalize the criticism and assume they deserve it. As for other students, they might have been afraid to speak up, or their parents might not have known what was happening. I thought about the past few weeks, trying to remember any signs I might have missed. Mason had seemed more withdrawn lately, less eager to talk about school. There were mornings when he'd complained of stomach aches or headaches, trying to stay home. I'd attributed it to normal childhood reluctance to go to school, maybe some anxiety about his reading difficulties. I'd had no idea he was walking into a classroom where his teacher was systematically destroying his confidence. What exactly happened after she made those comments? According to the students I've spoken with, Mason started crying. Mrs. Blackwood told him to leave the classroom. If he couldn't handle constructive criticism, Mason gathered his things and ran out. That's when another student, Emma Wilson, raised her hand and told Mrs. Blackwood that what she'd said was mean and unfair. I knew Emma. She was one of Mason's closest friends, a bright, outspoken girl who'd been in classes with him since kindergarten. The thought of her having to defend my son from an adult who was supposed to protect and nurture him made my chest tight with emotion. Mrs. Blackwood told Emma to mind her own business and threatened her with detention if she didn't drop the subject, but Emma persisted. She said that Mason works harder than anyone in their class and that it wasn't fair to call him worthless. Other students began nodding in agreement, and Mrs. Blackwood became increasingly agitated. What did she do then? She assigned Emma detention and told the class that if anyone else wanted to stick up for laziness and excuses, they could join her. The classroom fell silent after that. Mrs. Blackwood attempted to continue with the lesson, but several students were visibly upset. When the class ended 20 minutes later, 3 different children immediately went to other teachers to report what had happened. I closed my eyes, trying to process everything Principal Rodriguez was telling me. Mrs. Blackwood had been teaching at Lincoln Elementary for over 15 years. She had tenure, union protection, and a reputation as a no-nonsense educator. Who got results? She taught advanced 5th grade English and was known for preparing students well for middle school. Parents often requested her specifically because of her academic standards, but somewhere along the way, high standards had apparently morphed into cruelty. Rigorous expectations had become emotional abuse, and my son had been the target. Where did Mason go when he left the classroom? He went to the bathroom and stayed there until the end of the period. Mrs. Patterson found him there during her next break and brought him to the counselor's office. They said he was inconsolable. Mrs. Patterson was the reading specialist who'd been working with Mason since his dyslexia diagnosis. She was a gentle, patient woman in her 60s who'd spent decades helping children overcome learning challenges. She understood Mason's struggles better than anyone at the school, and she'd always been one of his biggest advocates. Has Mrs. Patterson said anything about Mrs. Blackwood's teaching methods? Principal Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Mrs. Patterson has expressed concerns about Mrs. Blackwood's approach to struggling readers. She's mentioned that. Several of her students have become increasingly anxious about reading aloud in Mrs. Blackwood's class. We've scheduled meetings to discuss differentiated instruction methods, but Mrs. Blackwood has been resistant to implementing them. I felt my anger building again, but this time it was cold and controlled.
Oh.
This wasn't just about today's incident. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to continue despite warning signs. This was about a teacher who'd lost sight of why she'd entered education in the first place. I want to see my son, of course. But before you do, I want you to know what steps we're taking. I've already contacted the district office and spoken with the superintendent. Mrs. Blackwood has been suspended pending a full investigation. I've also arranged for a substitute teacher to take over her classes for the remainder of the week. What about long term? What happens after the investigation? That will depend on what we find, but I can tell you that this kind of behavior towards students is grounds for serious disciplinary action, potentially including termination. I nodded. But my focus had already shifted to Mason. How is he? I mean, really, how is he? He's shaken, understandably. Mrs. Chen has been working with him to process what happened, and she's given him some coping strategies for the immediate term. But Mr. Harrison, I think it's important that you consider having Mason speak with a counselor outside of school as well. This kind of verbal abuse from a trusted adult can have lasting effects on a child's self-esteem and academic confidence. Word abuse hung in the air between us. I'd been thinking it, but hearing Principal Rodriguez say it out loud made it real in a way that was almost unbearable. My son had been verbally abused by his teacher, the woman who was supposed to encourage. His love of learning had instead made him feel worthless and stupid. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Can I see him now? Absolutely. But Mr. Harrison, when you talk to Mason, please be careful not to make him feel like this was his fault in any way. Children often blame themselves when adults treat them poorly. As we walked toward the counselor's office, Principal Rodriguez continued talking, but I was only half listening. My mind was already on Mason, on what I would say to him, on how I could possibly begin to repair the damage that had been done. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that sometimes adults make terrible mistakes? How do you restore trust in authority figures when one of them has betrayed that trust so completely? We stopped outside Mrs. Chen's office, and through the small window in the door, I could see my son sitting in a chair that seemed too big for him. His shoulders slumped, his face red and puffy from crying. My heart broke a little more with each detail I noticed. His rumpled shirt, his untied shoelaces, the way he was clutching a tissue in his small hands. This was my boy, my Mason, who'd always been sensitive and kind. He worked twice as hard as his classmates just to keep up, who never gave up despite the challenges his dyslexia presented. And someone had called him worthless. I took a deep breath and knocked softly on the door. It was time to begin the long process of healing, both for Mason and for our family's trust in the educational system that had failed him so profoundly. Mrs. Chen opened the door with a gentle smile that didn't quite mask the concern in her eyes. She was a petite woman in her 40s with kind features and a voice that immediately put people at ease. As the school counselor, she'd dealt with countless difficult situations, but I could see this one had affected her deeply. "Mason, your dad is here," she said softly. My son looked up, and the sight of his tear-stained face nearly undid me. His usually bright blue eyes were rimmed with red, and there was something in his expression I'd never seen before, a kind of defeated resignation that no 10-year-old should ever have to carry. "Hey, buddy," I said, crouching down to his level.
How are you doing?"
Mason's lip trembled, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. "Dad, I'm sorry. I tried to read it right. I really did." But the words got all jumbled up again, and she got so mad, my heart shattered completely. Here was my son apologizing to me for being humiliated by an adult who should have known better. I pulled him into my arms, feeling how small and fragile he seemed. "Mason, listen to me very carefully. You have absolutely nothing to apologize for. Nothing that happened today was your fault. You hear me?" He nodded against my shoulder, but I could feel the tension in his small body. Mrs. Chen gestured for us to sit on the comfortable couch in her office, and Mason curled up next to me, still clinging to my arm like he was afraid I might disappear. "Mason has been very brave today," Mrs. Chen said. "He told me exactly what happened, and he also shared some other things that have been bothering him about school lately." I looked down at my son. "What other things, buddy?" Mason wiped his nose with the back of his hand. Mrs. Blackwood doesn't. Like me, Dad. She never smiles when I raise my hand, and when I get answers wrong, she does this with her face, he demonstrated, scrunching up his features into an exaggerated expression of disgust. She makes that face at a lot of kids. He continued, not just me. Tommy Chen got it last week when he couldn't remember the state capitals. And Sarah? Williams cried after math class because Mrs. Blackwood said her handwriting looked like chicken scratches. Each revelation was like another punch to the gut. This wasn't an isolated incident or a teacher having a bad day. This was a pattern of behavior that had been traumatizing children for weeks, maybe months. Why didn't you tell me about this before? I asked gently. Mason shrugged, a gesture that seemed too world-weary for someone his age. I thought maybe if I got better at reading, she'd be nicer. Mrs. Patterson always says I'm improving. Mrs. Blackwood acts like I'm not even trying. Injustice of it all overwhelmed me. Mason worked with his tutor 3 times a week after school. We practiced reading together every night. He'd made tremendous progress over the past 2 years, but dyslexia doesn't just disappear because you work hard. It's something he'll manage his whole life, and he needed teachers who understood that. Mrs. Chen, I said, has Mason mentioned feeling unsafe or anxious about going to Mrs. Blackwood's class? Before she could answer, Mason spoke up. I get sick feelings in my stomach every morning during announcements because I know I have to. Go to her class after lunch. Sometimes I ask to go to the nurse because my tummy hurts, but it's not really my tummy. It's more like ... scared feelings. Mrs. Chen nodded knowingly. Anxiety often manifests as physical symptoms in children. Mason described having trouble sleeping on Sunday nights because he's worried about the school week starting. I remembered those Sunday evening battles. Mason suddenly finding reasons why he couldn't go to bed, needing water, having to use the bathroom, wanting to check if his backpack was packed for the 4th time. I'd attributed it to normal childhood, bedtime resistance, but now I understood it was dreadful. What happens now? I asked Mrs. Chen. Beyond the investigation, how do we help Mason feel safe at school again? Well, the immediate concern is making sure Mason knows that what happened today was completely inappropriate. Children need to understand that adults sometimes make serious mistakes, and when they do, other adults step in to make things right. Turn to Mason. You know how sometimes when you make a mistake, we talk about how to fix it and do better next time? Mason nodded. Well, adults have to do that too. Mrs. Blackwood made a very big mistake today, and now the grown-ups at school are going to figure out how to fix it and make sure it doesn't happen again. Is she going to say sorry to me? Mason asked. The question was so innocent, so hopeful, that it nearly broke my heart all over again. At 10 years old, he still believed that apologies could fix everything. That saying sorry was enough to heal the wounds left by cruel words. I don't know, sweetie, Mrs. Chen said honestly. But what I do know is that you're going to have a new teacher for the rest of the week. And we're going to make sure whoever teaches your class understands how hard you work and how much you've improved in reading. Will Mrs. Patterson still help me? Mason asked, and I could hear the worry in his voice. Absolutely, I assured him. Mrs. Patterson thinks you're amazing, and she's not going anywhere. Mrs. Chen handed Mason a small card with her name and office hours on it. And remember, my door is always open if you need to talk about anything. Sometimes big feelings are easier to handle when you share them with someone. As we prepared to leave, Mason tugged on my sleeve. Dad, can we not tell Mom about this? She'll get really upset, and she has that big presentation at work tomorrow. The fact that my 10-year-old was trying to protect his mother from emotional distress showed both his maturity and how much this experience had aged him, but there was no way I was keeping this from Jennifer. Buddy, Mom needs to know what happened because she loves you and she want to help figure out how to make things better. And don't worry about her presentation. You're more important than any work meeting. As we walked through the now empty hallways toward the exit, Mason's hand in mine, I couldn't help but notice how different the school felt. The cheerful decorations and student artwork that had seemed welcoming this morning now felt like a facade hiding something darker underneath. Dad, Mason said as we reached the car. Yeah, buddy. Am I really worthless at reading? The question hit me like a physical blow. I stopped walking and knelt down in the parking lot, taking both of his hands in mine. Mason Christopher Harrison, you listen to me? You're not worthless at anything. You're one of the smartest, kindest, most determined kids I know. Your brain just processes words differently than some other people, and that's not your fault. It's not a weakness. It's just a difference. But I'm so slow, and I make mistakes. Do you remember when you were learning to ride your bike? I asked. He nodded. You fell down a bunch of times, remember? But you kept getting back up and trying again. Now you can ride your bike anywhere you want. Reading is the same thing. It takes you a little longer to learn than some kids, but you never give up, and that makes you incredibly strong. For the first time since I'd arrived at school, Mason's face brightened slightly. Mrs. Patterson says I'm like a detective because I figure out hard words by looking for clues. Exactly. You're a word detective, and detectives are very smart. And very important. As we drove home, Mason was quiet, staring out the window at the familiar neighborhoods we passed. I called Jennifer from the car, putting her on speaker so Mason could hear the conversation. As expected, she was furious about what had happened, but she kept her voice calm and supportive for Mason's sake. We'll talk more when I get home. She said, Mason, I love you so much, and I'm so proud of how you handled everything today. Thanks, Mom, he said quietly. That evening, after Mason had gone to bed, Jennifer and I sat at our kitchen table with cups of coffee that had long gone cold, trying to process everything that had happened. The house felt different somehow, like an innocence had been lost that we couldn't quite get back. What kind of person says that to a child? Jennifer asked for the third time, her voice thick with emotion. I shook my head. I'd been asking myself the same question all evening. Mrs. Blackwood wasn't some rookie teacher who'd lost her temper. She was a veteran educator who'd worked with hundreds of children over the years. She knew the impact her words could have. I keep thinking about all the signs we might have missed, Jennifer continued. The Sunday night anxiety, the stomach aches, the way he's been so quiet about school lately. We couldn't have known, I said, though I was struggling with the same. Guilt. He's 10 years old. Shouldn't have to advocate for himself against an adult in a position of authority. We talked until nearly midnight, planning our next steps and trying to figure out how to rebuild Mason's confidence. But even as we made lists and strategies, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted for our family. The trust we'd placed in the educational system had been shattered, and I wasn't sure how long it would take to repair. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood perfectly. Mason had barely touched his breakfast and kept glancing toward his backpack with the same expression someone might reserve for a coiled snake. Jennifer had taken the day off work to be with him, but I had other plans. I'm going to the school. Board meeting today, I announced over coffee. Jennifer looked up sharply. The investigation just started yesterday. This isn't about the investigation anymore. This is about making sure no other child goes through what Mason did. What Jennifer didn't know, what I hadn't told her yet, was that I'd spent most of the night researching Mrs. Blackwood's employment history. 23 years in education, the last 15 at Lincoln Elementary. 3 previous complaints filed against her over the years, all involving inappropriate comments to struggling students. Each complaint had been dismissed after brief investigations. With Mrs. Blackwood receiving nothing more than verbal warnings, the school board met every second. Thursday of the month in the district administrative building downtown. I'd attended exactly one meeting in my 15 years as a parent, and that was to advocate for extended library hours. Today would be different. I arrived 30 minutes early and wasn't surprised to find the parking lot nearly empty. School board. Meetings typically drew maybe a dozen people, mostly district employees and the occasional parent with a specific concern. I sat in my car for a few minutes, organizing my thoughts and reviewing the notes I'd prepared. At exactly 3 p.m., I walked through the doors of the administrative building. The meeting room was beige and institutional, with fluorescent lights that buzzed slightly and a smell that reminded me of old textbooks. Board members were filing in, most of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. I recognized Superintendent Dr. Williams immediately, a tall woman in her 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. She'd been with the district for over a decade and had a reputation for being both fair and tough. Board President Tom Morrison was there too, local businessman who'd served on the board for 8 years. As the meeting began with routine budget discussions and policy updates, I waited and waited. Nearly an hour passed before they reached public comments on the agenda. "We have one speaker today," Dr. Williams announced. "Mr. David Harrison." I stood up, suddenly aware that every eye in the room was focused on me. The board members looked mildly curious, probably expecting a complaint about bus routes or cafeteria food. They had no idea what was coming. "Good afternoon. My name is David Harrison, and my son Mason is a 5th grade student at Lincoln Elementary." Yesterday afternoon, Mason's teacher, Mrs. Rebecca Blackwood, called him worthless in front of his entire class. The room went completely silent. I could see Dr. Williams's posture straighten, and several board members exchanged glances. "Now, I understand that Principal Rodriguez has already contacted your office about this incident, and I appreciate that Mrs. Blackwood has been suspended pending investigation. But I'm not here just about yesterday's incident. I'm here about a pattern." I pulled out my phone and began reading from my notes. March 2019. Parent complaint filed against Mrs. Blackwood for telling a student with ADHD that he was too stupid to sit still. Dismissed after internal review. October 2021. Complaint filed for telling a student that her learning disability was just an excuse for laziness. Dismissed with verbal warning. January 2023. Complaint about Mrs. Blackwood. Publicly mocking a student's stutter during oral presentations. Again, dismissed with counseling. The silence in the room was deafening. Dr. Williams had stopped taking notes and was staring directly at me. Board President Morrison was frowning deeply. Yesterday wasn't an isolated incident or a teacher having a bad day. Yesterday was the inevitable result of allowing inappropriate behavior to continue unchecked for years. And my question for this board is simple. How many children have to be emotionally damaged before we say enough is enough? Board member Susan Chen, who I now realized was probably related to the school counselor, leaned forward. Information about previous complaints? I'd been expecting this question. I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the district this morning for all personnel records related to complaints against teachers in the past 5 years. I received the redacted files about 2 hours ago, so it wasn't entirely true. The FOJA request would take weeks to process, but my law firm had connections throughout the district, and sometimes information found its way to concerned parents through unofficial channels. The important thing was that everything I'd said was accurate. What I find most disturbing, I continued, is that Mrs. Blackwood specializes in advanced English instruction. She specifically works with the district's most academically vulnerable students, children who are already struggling, children who need extra support and encouragement. Instead, she's been systematically destroying their confidence and love of learning. Dr. Williams finally spoke. "Mr. Harrison, I want to assure you that we take these allegations very seriously. And with respect, Dr. Williams, your track record suggests otherwise. 3 previous complaints, 3 dismissals, no real consequences. Meanwhile, children continue to suffer. My son came home yesterday convinced he was worthless. 10-year-old child with dyslexia who works harder than most adults I know, believes. He's stupid because a teacher told him so." The emotion in my voice surprised even me. I'd planned to stay clinical, professional, lawyer-like. But sitting in that sterile room, thinking about Mason's tear-stained face, I couldn't maintain the distance. Board member Jennifer Walsh spoke up. "What outcome are you seeking, Mr. Harrison?" "I want Mrs. Blackwood removed from the classroom permanently, not transferred to another school, not given administrative duties, not allowed to retire quietly with full benefits. Terminated. She's proven repeatedly that she cannot be trusted with children." "That's a very serious request, Dr. Williams." Said carefully, "It's a very serious situation. But more than that, I want systematic changes. I want mandatory training for all teachers on working with learning differences. I want clear protocols for addressing complaints against staff members. And I want accountability, real accountability, when teachers abuse their positions." The room remained quiet for several moments. Finally, Board President Morrison spoke. "Mr. Harrison, We appreciate you bringing these concerns to our attention. We will be conducting a thorough review of this situation and will be in touch with you directly about our findings and any actions taken. It was a politician's answer, carefully crafted to say nothing while sounding concerned. But something in Dr. Williams's expression told me this wouldn't be swept under the rug like the previous complaints. As I gathered my papers to leave, Dr. Williams approached me. "Mr. Harrison, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" We stepped into a small conference room adjacent to the main meeting area. Dr. Williams closed the door behind us and turned to face me directly. "I want you to know that I wasn't aware of the pattern you described today. Personnel complaints typically go through HR and building principals before reaching my office, and clearly something has fallen through the cracks." "In 4 years isn't falling through the cracks," I said. "It's a system that prioritizes protecting employees over protecting children." She nodded slowly. "You're right. And I want you to know that this ends now. Mrs. Blackwood will not be returning to any classroom in this district." "Can you guarantee that?" "I can guarantee that I will personally ensure this situation is handled appropriately. I'd like to meet with you and your wife next week to discuss the systematic changes you mentioned. Some of your suggestions align with initiatives we've been considering, and your input could be valuable." 2 weeks later, Mason walked into Lincoln Elementary with a smile on his face for the first time since October. His new teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, Principal Rodriguez's nephew, as it turned out, was a young man fresh out of graduate school who specialized in inclusive education and learning differences. Mrs. Blackwood had been terminated 3 days after the board meeting. The district announcement cited conduct incompatible with district values and student welfare. She filed a grievance through the teachers' union, but when the full extent of her behavior came to light during the investigation, even her union representatives recommended she seek career counseling rather than fight the termination. The real victory, though, came 6 weeks later when Mason raised his hand in Mr. Rodriguez's class and volunteered to read aloud. He stumbled over a few words, paused to sound out others, and took longer than many of his classmates would have. When he finished the paragraph, Mr. Rodriguez smiled and said, "Excellent job, Mason. I could tell you were really thinking about the meaning of what you were reading." That afternoon, Mason bounded into the house with an energy I hadn't seen in months. "Dad, guess what happened in reading today?" "What happened, buddy?" "I read 3 whole pages, and Mr. Rodriguez said I did great. And when I got stuck on magnificent, Emma helped me sound it out, and Mr. Rodriguez said, 'That's what good classmates do. They help each other learn.'" As I watched my son's excitement about reading something that had become a source of anxiety and shame, I realized that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in courtrooms or boardrooms. Sometimes they're fought in elementary school classrooms, one child at a time, by adults who remember that their most important job isn't teaching subjects, but nurturing human beings. Mrs. Blackwood had called Mason worthless, but she had an idea that she was dealing with a child who had parents willing to fight for him, a community ready to support him, and most importantly, a strength within himself that no cruel words could ever truly destroy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.